Last time we began talking about the progressive reform movement of the early 20th century, focusing on the roots or sources of the movement and some of the key features of the progressive movement. And we also talked a little bit about the progressive presidents, especially Theodore Roosevelt and his successor, William Howard Taft. Taft won the presidency with Roosevelt's blessing, but Roosevelt soon became very disenchanted with Taft, and so in 1912 he decided to challenge him for the Republican nomination. Taft still managed to get the nomination of the GOP, so Roosevelt went off and joined the Progressive Party and accepted their nomination for president. The Democrats nominated the progressive governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. So in many ways, the 1912 election marked the high water mark of the progressive reform movement. Wilson had a solid record as a progressive governor. Roosevelt had a very well-established record as a progressive president, and even Taft, though much more conservative in many respects than either Roosevelt or Wilson, could also claim to be a progressive. And the Socialist Party nominated Eugene Debs, who ended up getting almost 1 million votes, far better than any socialist candidate had ever done before. The election of 1912 was a lively one, largely because of the personalities involved. Both Roosevelt and Wilson ran on progressive platforms. For the most part, the 1912 campaign was carried out on the issues. Taft soon became the odd man out because he simply couldn't compete with the giant personalities of Roosevelt and Wilson. So as the campaign entered its final weeks, it was pretty much, will the voters put Wilson in office or will they return to the progressive candidate Theodore Roosevelt? On October 14, 1912, as Roosevelt was getting ready to deliver a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he was shot in the chest by a fanatic named John Schrank. The bullet penetrated a folded copy of his speech, and his glasses case, which he had in his coat pocket, broke one of his ribs and lodged close to his right lung. Despite his serious gunshot wound, Roosevelt insisted on giving his speech anyway before seeking medical treatment. He stood up before the crowd, took out a copy of his blood-soaked manuscript, and proceeded to talk for an hour and a half about his progressive program, after which he finally agreed to go to the hospital and have the bullet removed. One of the surgeons who operated on him said, "It is largely due to the fact that he is a physical marvel that he was not dangerously wounded. He is one of the most powerful men I have ever seen laid on an operating table. The bullet lodged in the massive muscles of the chest instead of penetrating the lung." So I suppose Roosevelt is a good advertisement for bodybuilding, though it might also be said he's a good advertisement for being long-winded, because if he had not had an hour-and-a-half long speech folded up in his pocket, he might still have been killed. Anyway, after such a vibrant campaign, the last couple of weeks are somewhat anticlimactic, because with Roosevelt recovering from a gunshot wound, Wilson decided that it would be unseemly to continue to campaign. When Election Day finally rolled around in November, Wilson won the election, although he got less than 50% of the total popular vote. But the vote was split, the anti-Wilson vote, if you want to put it that way, was split among Roosevelt, Taft, and Eugene Debs. Still, Wilson won enough electoral votes to become president and took office in 1913 with a very well-thought-out program of progressive reform. Wilson would actually accomplish almost all of his goals during his first term in office, highlighted by the Underwood-Simmons tariff of 1913, which was the first major reduction in the tariff since the Civil War. Part of the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of 1913 included the first permanent federal income tax. Congress had been given the authority to do this by the 16th Amendment, which had just been passed and ratified. And a federal income tax was another of the goals of the populists. Wilson also secured passage of the first major banking and currency reform since the Civil War in the form of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. In 1914, Wilson also secured passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act and the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, two major pieces of regulatory legislation. As Wilson planned to run for another term in 1916, he pushed for another wave of progressive reform in order to shore up his base, as they say nowadays. So in 1916, Wilson secured passage of the Federal Farm Loan Act, which finally made possible the old populist dream of low-interest farm loans. Other reforms were made in the field of labor law in 1916, with Wilson securing passage of a workmen's compensation system for federal employees. And 1916 also saw passage of the Adamson 8-Hour Act, which mandated an 8-hour workday for railroad workers and served as something of a model for 8-hour legislation in other industries. Progressivism thus reached its peak during Wilson's first administration. As it would turn out, though, Wilson's second term would be almost completely dominated by foreign policy, and the main issue was the Great War, World War I, and whether or not the United States would participate. Next time, we'll back up in time a little bit and look at America's increasing role in the world, including its participation in World War I.